This song was one of Defected Records' top-selling tracks of 2023, and was actually a remix of a song that's been called a benchmark for what modern house music is. But the crazy part of all of this is that even though it's been supported by top DJs like Mark Knight, Ferric Dawn, and Seth Trockler to name a few, a high-quality song like this can actually be made much faster and easier in 2025. So in this video, we'll be making a soulful modern house song inspired by Groove Assassin's remix of the Vision song, Hallelujah in Heaven. And we're gonna find out if we can do this in under 6 hours by using the 80-20 rule of music production. What you're listening to is the finished song we'll be breaking down today. This tune only took me about 6 hours to finish, completely arranged, mixed, mastered, and ready to be used in DJ sets and sent out to record labels. After having produced music for over 15 years, this is easily the fastest and best way I've come across. You can download this video's project files, as well as over 30 full project files inspired by Beatport Top 100 songs, with new files being added weekly. Just visit the link on screen or in the description. And if finishing songs super fast like this is something you'd like help with, you can also download a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use to completely finish one song per week. But for now, let's start with the first of the 4 quick and easy steps we'll be covering today. First, make sure your song is inspired by the quality of a professional example by choosing a reference track. But stop yourself from straight up copying your reference by having a new hook to focus on. For each one of my projects, I like to make a project file page like this to act as a guide for you to see all the little production tricks and the process in more detail and at your own pace. But for this one, the reference here is that Groove Assassin's remix of this Vision tune here. And one of the reasons that I picked it is kind of a little story here. A few years back, I went to Philadelphia to play a show and do a collab with a bunch of artists out there. And it was some event that was happening like at the dock at this abandoned pier, and there was a really sick DJ group there playing. I forgot what their names were, but they dropped this song in particular. And usually at like raves and stuff, I'll be Shazamming a lot of stuff. So after I Shazammed this song, and I've been listening to it a ton after that, and then I started singing it in like so many cool DJ sets. And this song is really awesome. I've been using it in my own DJ sets as well. It's like such a cool, soulful, vibey house tune. And so it was a no-brainer that I've been trying to use this as a reference track for a while. So moving over to the new hook in this instance, going for a remix of a song called Party All Night by an artist named Vibes, who's from the UK. And the main reason this kind of came to be is her sister Mallory is also an artist, and we've worked on quite a few tunes together. I've done a few remixes for her. Some of our original stuff has done pretty well on like Spotify and stuff like that, and she's just a really good friend. And so when her sister here was putting this song out, she was like really adamant about me trying to work on a remix for it. So we kind of like started figuring it out, and this vibe of this Party All Night song, I felt like finally matched kind of this Groove Assassin edit here. And so it was a perfect opportunity to kind of mishmash them together. That's kind of a little story of how these two were picked. But you also might be wondering, when you're doing this, kind of figuring out your new hook and figuring out what reference you want to use and how they might actually work together. How do you know that they will actually work together? And how can you make sure that when you're making these kind of decisions and mapping out your vision for a song, that you won't spend hours or weeks working on this just to find out that it doesn't work? So here's how some very simple music theory can help. Basically, I'll just look up a very simple things here. So for the reference track, it's in the key of C minor. And I'll also look that up for the remix track, which is in B minor. So in each of these guides, I have this little music theory cheat sheet that I'll use. And so really simple stuff here. They're both in minor keys. And if we see here, one's in B and one's in C, this shows us that like there's really just a semitone of difference away. So it's very easy to kind of pitch them to get them in the same area there. So that's super simple stuff. And then the next thing is the tempo. So the reference track is 124 beats per minute, and the new hook here is 126. So it's very close. We know that we're going to be able to pitch them easily to get them to kind of match, and the tempo isn't like a wild difference where it's going to sound like a chipmunk, or it's going to maybe ruin the original character of the tune. So the key takeaway here is to really take some time to think through your vision. 10 or 15 minutes is really all it takes to kind of do a little bit of of research and looking up the keys and all that kind of stuff. And you do that at the beginning, and it's going to give you that confidence knowing that you have something awesome and worthwhile to keep you motivated and focused from start to finish, because it's actually going to be sounding sick the more you work on it, right? But none of this actually matters unless you actually start testing out the idea in your music making software and confirm your idea works. So what I'll do is I'll add these two files into my special Ableton template here, and then use AI to separate out the stems and start pitching things around to make sure that the keys are compatible. And also, I should mention before we actually dive into Ableton, you can find dedicated tutorials on this this guide, as well as in the link in the description, there's a YouTube playlist that covers a lot of these things as well, because we're going to be going a little bit faster through this. But also, I should mention, if you grab the free producer toolkit I mentioned, you'll get access to all of the project files pages for these. You just won't be able to actually click in and download the project files. But with that said, let's jump into this. All right, so this is a look at the Ableton project file after about maybe 20 or 30 minutes of producing. And so the first thing I'll do is I'll throw the reference track into here, and I'll disable it and map the S key on my keyboard so I can flick back and forth between the reference and what I'm making. This way you can kind of like really pay attention to the layers and build your track properly. Then I'll create this little arrangement structure track here. And what this is just empty MIDI clips showing the main sections of the song structure, which is going to come in handy in a couple different ways, both for layer building and when we're actually finishing the loop, turning it from a loop into an actual finished tune. So then the next thing is what we want to do is get to the point where we're working on melodic stuff as quickly as possible. So this is like the bass and the vocals and all the chords and all that. Main reason is drums are really awesome and it could be a good foundation for the tune, but it's really with a melodic area where things can kind of get messed up and maybe you're not working in the right key and the idea doesn't work and you end up abandoning it. So the idea is to get to that point as quickly as possible. So the best trick that I've been finding lately is finding like a 8 or maybe 4 even bar section of the tune where you really want to build around that. Set your loop markers around that area. So in this section here, it's the sub that comes in, and then you can use AI to extract out the drums. And so when you extract out the drums, it sounds like this. Sounds pretty good. It's pretty usable. Obviously, it's very much has the same character of the reference track. So it's like a nice way to kind of have a temporary loop that you can use to get started. But because the low end is so important, what we actually want to do is remove all the low end with like an EQ, maybe cutting everything below maybe 200 hertz or something like this. And then this way, what you have is this. And what this is almost like a custom temporary top loop with the kick removed. This way we can get our own kick in there. The kick is so important to the low end, especially in like dance music. That low end relationship is so important. So it's really important to kind of isolate it. So what I've been doing lately is, if we have a listen now to the drums with the AI drums and the kick that I have. And here's a listen to the kick by itself. So there's a couple different things you can do. You can slice out a kick from the AI drum loop, or from the intro, or from the outro. Usually there's like the drums are playing by itself in the extended mixes. But I've been using this thing called Drum Clone, and what you can do is grab that slice of the kick, and instead of doing anything like EQing it to try to isolate it, you can drop it into Drum Clone, and it'll actually process it, analyze it, and re-synthesize it using like sine waves and stuff like that to synthesize a similar sounding kick. And this way, what you have, like the end result here, sounds pretty awesome, I would say. And it has like the same character and vibe as the kick from the reference, but it's actually resynthesized, and so it sounds a lot more high quality, and it's a lot more usable. So what I'll have is something like that. In terms of any processing, there is, I've been sometimes throwing on drum bus, particularly with this boom amount. You can add a kind of like a subbiness to the low end of the kick drum, which can sound quite nice. But this way, what we have is a nice drum loop that has the character of our reference, with our kick isolated and high quality, so we can really dial that in, and we can move on to the more melodic stuff as quickly as possible. So for me, the next thing would be to add in the bass. So let's have a look and listen to the bass that's been added in here in the context of the entire drum loop. So the cool thing here is What you can also do is if you have, if you stem separate out the bass as well, then you have a bass audio separated track. And if you grab that AI bass and drop it into an empty MIDI clip, what you'll see is something like this. So Ableton actually has an audio to MIDI converter, so you can select the melody option, and then you can see here that it's going to listen to that bass line, and it's going to try its best to create the notes. And what this is a good starting point. It's usually quite off, but it does seem to be getting better and better. You'll usually see maybe there's too many notes and you kind of need to simplify it, but it gives you a good starting point to kind of get the initial bass notes down. And so then really for me, the way that I'll do it is it's just a matter of like flicking back and forth to the reference and what you're working on and adjusting and simplifying the notes to kind of dial it in quite a bit. And this is something that you'll get better at the more and more you do it. You'll kind of pick up an ear for figuring out the right notes. But this is a look at what I ended up with, kind of simplified it and made it so it's just mostly just pedaling on one note with like a little bit of almost like a fill coming in here with this extra high note that comes in. And that is the process for the bass. First thing is the pattern, then it's the sound design. So when it comes to the sound design, what I usually like to start with is like a basic sub. So what you're listening to here is just like a sub. And so I just created my own little rack here. It's an operator doing a sine wave. So it's a nice, very simple wave shape that carries a lot of low end in a really, really nice way. And then it's just a matter of adding in a bit of different saturation to kind of add a little bit of grit. And it also kind of makes it so it comes out of like crappy speakers a little bit more. And what we're going to be doing is we have the sub isolated and we're going to have a mid bass layer that's going to take care of a lot more of the character. And by adding a bit of saturation to the sub, it's also going to almost act as like a bridge harmonically because it adds a bit of harmonic content in the low mids to kind of like help blend in a little bit more with the mid bass to create a more natural, congruent sound. Other than that, there's like sidechain built into it. So I have a one knob sidechain here. That way I don't have to do any routing with compressors, anything like that. It's really about moving quickly and on to the next step. And a nice thing about working with the sub is that it's a clean sound. So you can really dial in the right notes at this point, almost as if you were figuring something out on a piano or guitar. I played with this thing. I heard somebody talking about this, throwing on a ring mod onto the sub bass to kind of have it come out a bit more. So I tried that for this tune. It's kind of cool. I don't know if I didn't really use this technique again, but it's something I did there. And then what's going on with the bass here is there's a couple different layers, and you'll also notice that there's only one MIDI clip. So the idea is you can actually play with the routing so that the MIDI actually comes in from the sub layer into these additional mid bass layers. That way you don't have to like copy and paste MIDI clips over and over again, especially if you make a change to the tune at any point. So there's a full video in like the playlist and all that goes over this. But the idea is to then have a pitch device in case you need to change the octave, and then you want to remove everything under about 200 hertz or so in order to make it so that the sub is just taking care of all the low end. That way you can kind of go crazy on these mid bass layers with sound design, knowing that you're not going to be messing up the quality of the low end. You can really just focus on the character. So let's have a listen to the first layer that I added here. And with the sub. So it's adding a bit more of like a guitar-y, disco-y kind of character, which I like quite a bit. And then the other thing that I added in was this synth plant layer. So it's also very similar to like a bass guitar layer. And the idea that I did here is there's this cool thing called synth plant 2. And when you have it on this setting here, which I won't update it right now, what you can do is when we had that AI bass audio, you can grab a little slice of that and drag it into here. And this is going to use like machine learning AI to try to resynthesize that audio sample. And so you can kind of get something that it always sounds a little weirder. It doesn't sound like a perfect like recreation of that melodic instrument, but I kind of like that in a weird way. It kind of starts to take it into a more interesting, unique sounding territory, which I like. So that's a cool way to kind of develop some different synth sounds without having to know traditional sound design by using like interesting weird tips like this. So altogether the bass sounds like this. And then with all the drums. And then the next thing I want to go over is, so when I first created that bass line, it sounded a lot even more so like the actual the reference track. So what I like to then do is introduce the new hook. In this instance, it's the Vibes vocal track, and add that in there so that you can kind of start adjusting the bass line to the vocal So it's starting to push it into a bit of a more unique territory. This is like the final product sounds awesome, and I'm really happy with it, but I really want to show you this first version of the project, because when I first added in the vocals, I made a huge mistake and it almost like destroyed the entire project. So take a listen to the drums, bass, and the vocals at this point. Tell me if you can tell, like, hear what's off on this. So if you could tell, the vocals have been pitched into like the wrong key. So I think I pitched them down one semitone instead of, I was supposed to pitch it up a semitone, something like that. And I remember sending it to both Mallory, like this artist's sister, and also Vibes as well. And I remember Vibes was like, something sounds weird. I don't know what. It sounds cool though, but I can't really tell. And then my friend Mallory and Vibes' sister was like, yeah, you pitched this wrong. We were at a party, and I remember she was like, we were talking about it, and it was really good to have that feedback there. So when we move on to the next phase of the production, I'm going to show you how I end up solving this, because this almost jeopardized the entire production, and this is why I mentioned like trying to get to the melodic stuff as quickly as possible. Because imagine like I didn't solve this problem of the vocals being out of key. And imagine I built out the drums layer by layer by layer by layer by layer, then got to the bass, then got to the vocals, and then found out that I couldn't fix this. The whole project would be wasted, and it would be like a whole bunch of wasted time. So the idea of using like AI to separate out the drums so you can move on to the melodic stuff quicker is for this exact reason, to make sure that you're solving the problems that need to be solved as quickly as possible. And that kind of concludes more or less the first phase. In the next section of this video, I'm going to start talking about what I did in the kind of the next phases. But this is more or less what I try to aim to get done in the first 20 or 30 minutes. Altogether, it's about maybe the first hour of producing when it comes to like researching the kind of reference tracks and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so the next thing would actually be to move into building up additional layers. And that is really the point where adding in these additional melodic layers, which we're going to get into. And then I'm going to show you how I actually built out the drums as well. But it's in that process of building up the melodic layers that I realized that the vocals were wrong and started to solve the problem. But this was almost like a make it or break it thing. So I'm really excited to show you how this problem was solved. But now let's fast forward another 2 or 3 hours to the actual finished project file and take a listen to the kind of the main drop at this point. And here, let's see if you can find out what some of the changes that have been done here to make this all make sense. Alright, so let's go ahead and start kind of like layer by layer as I built it out after after that first phase that we had there. And so what I want to focus on first is the melodic stuff. So have a listen to just all the melodic elements on their own, no drums, no bass, no vocals or anything like that. So the main thing really here is like that kind of piano lick that's happening on. There's a couple different layers that are building that up, and then there's some kind of more atmospheric elements, kind of like pads and little like vocal chops that are making things just sound a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to go through this, but I do want to mention when it gets to this point in particular, when you're building out like the melodic stuff, chords and all this kind of cool stuff, this is really where you should let like your freak flag fly. You should be going nuts, doing as much creative stuff as possible, really pushing it away from that reference if you can. What I will do is kind of go over the mindset of each layer that I'm going over, as well as some particular 80-20 mixing hacks that you can apply. And there will be a bunch of cool little tips here that you can find and tricks to apply to your own productions. But really, I do want to mention, when you're doing something like this yourself, definitely you should be going crazy. So let's go ahead and start with the first layer added, which was this piano. So this is something that was like a piano lick that was very similar to it in the Vibes remix, or the original Vibes track, as well as that How You and Happen tune. There's like kind of like a piano playing something similar like this. So to find this, I just looked up piano, house piano, or something like that on Splice, set it to the right key, and then found something I liked and then just kind of chopped it up so it was creating that similar kind of rhythm. In terms of any processing, this is like the standard channel strip mixing as you go strategy that I'll use down here. So the first thing is removing any lows, so we're getting rid of any kind of mud, making it so that the kick and the sub and the bass is the main thing occupying this area. And then usually going from like left to right, kind of starting off with the envelope of the information, so the attack and the sustain. So these two knobs here are the free kilohertz transient shaper, and this allows you to play with that initial hit of any kind of audio and the tail of it. So you can make it softer and also make it more tighter. So that's the main thing I'm doing here. The attack has been left alone, but the sustain I've brought back a little bit. I feel like tighter sounds that aren't ringing out as much tend to sound a little bit more professional and cohesive, and so that's something that's done here. Main thing is it's a free plugin. I've just mapped the knobs to like a rack so I can produce really quickly. That's really the main thing here. Next one here I want to point out is a sidechain. So this is just Max for Live shaper device going on quarter notes. So it's quarter notes is what the kick drum is playing. And so that way you can just use this one knob to kind of get a decent sidechain effect without having to do anything too crazy in terms of like adding all these compressors and triggers and all this kind of stuff. All that stuff I feel just slows you down. It's something you can go back to and fix later, but like quick and fast is really the trick, I think. And this is another one. It's a Polyverse's free plugin called Wider. And this is basically a one knob width effect, pushes things to the left and right a little bit, makes it a bit more stereo, and makes space in the middle for the really important things like vocals and that kind of thing. A little bit of saturation here to kind of add some little grit and character and make it come out a little bit more in terms of it's adding some additional harmonics. And these are kind of like the ideas that I'll kind of go through from track to track. So I'm going to explain a little bit more this first time, but then other than that, it's kind of just like quickly moving through this channel strip, because the main thing, very similar to what we're going to talk about quite a lot here when you're building against a reference track. First thing is figuring out the pattern, so these clips cut up here. Then is the sound selection, so finding these sounds. And then the third thing is really the volumes, like for in this example, flicking back and forth to the reference, focusing on the piano in the reference and trying to get our piano to have a similar volume. That's going to get us the 80-20 really there, like having 20% of the effort get us 80% of the result. This little channel strip thing is a little bit of an extra thing to push it a bit more into that 80% getting even better. So that's the idea there. Now we can move a little bit quicker through the rest of these. So the next element I added was this. So this is basically weird shit, and what the mindset here is going for a call and response. So this is a really important dynamic in dance music and house music in particular, having one like element be the call, and then instead of it just playing continuously, it pulls out and leaves room for another element to respond to it. So altogether those two sound like this. And so this is kind of a Best Friends Club thing, not really a Groove Assassin or the Vision kind of thing. I like finding like weirder sounds to kind of be doing this, like instead of just like a piano and then a response to the piano, some weird synth loop is what I found, and I feel like that's just kind of cooler and a little bit more interesting. In terms of any processing, we're just removing some of the lows, shelving out some of the highs. Shelving out could be a good way to make the highs less pronounced without the obvious like low pass filter effect, which can sound very like almost like a blanket's being put over stuff. It works sometimes, but sometimes you want a more subtle way to control the highs. A little bit of this auto pan, so it's moving around left and right a bit, just kind of interesting kind of ear candy technique. And we're doing some sidechain, a little bit of width, tightening it up by removing some of the sustain, and a little bit of additional saturation's been added. Next element I added was this. And so this is actually from the original Vibes tune, and what this is really doing is kind of playing off that piano-y bit that we added first. So having two different like layers of sounds just kind of makes it a little bit more interesting. Next thing I added in was this right here. And so this, I grabbed the AI extraction of this synth from the Groove Assassin edit, and then dropped that into here, and then cleaned up the MIDI a little bit to try to get a little bit of this like little more mellowed out Rhodes sounding element that I was really hearing in the Groove Assassin tune that I want to try to nestle in there. And so this is using the Ableton like electric piano kind of device here, using a little bit of a gate here. So what this is I believe it's sidechained to one of the synths here. Yeah, this synth here. So it's trying to cut off any of the sound that's playing when the when this synth isn't. So it's trying to match it almost, if that makes sense. And then a little bit of this RC20. So this is just adding some kind of like lo-fi kind of effect. And then we're just trying to really mellow it out by removing a bunch of the lows and removing a bunch of the highs. A little bit of sidechain, a little bit of removing the sustain a bit, and a little bit of saturation. Next thing is these little haze and ahs. So I'm going to kind of play them all together for you here. And you're kind of like, with one of the keyboards actually, because the idea here is there's a big call and response. So have a listen to how the vocals play off of the piano here. Super cool stuff here. So this is very, very, very much coded in the original from that Groove Assassin edit. Yeah, there's like definitely those cool like haze and stuff like that in that tune. And that's kind of what I was trying to replicate. And then to make it a little bit more different, I just found a bunch of different types. So there's almost like a little girl fucking saying hey here, like almost like a I don't know what that what's that artist, the Ray Charles kind of hey, I think that's the wrong name, James Brown kind of haze as well in here, and they're just kind of call and responding, and so some of them are a little bit on the left, some of them a bit on the right in terms of like call is happening on the left side of the speaker and it's being responded to on the right side. So there's like movement and some dynamicism going on here. In terms of any like processing, I'll just quickly show you each one here. There's really nothing going on. This is the default settings. I set mine up so it's automatically removing some lows and automatically sidechaining a little bit. That way you drop something in and it's a little bit closer to the final result, and so you can judge that new element a little bit better because you're hearing it mixed in a little bit already, which I think is really, really handy. Next element I added in was this little weird bit from the Vibe stems that I got. Kind of weird shit, basically, that I was trying to like fuck with a lot because there's a bunch of processing that I added on here. So I added on the auto shift and then set it to the key of the tune, so it's trying to like force this into the right key a little bit of removing the lows. And the main thing here is this A1 trigger gate, which is kind of like a cool stutter house kind of effect. This is free, by the way, definitely check this out. And that's kind of making it more stuttery and weirder, and then a little bit of a bit more sidechain than normal, a little bit of width, that kind of thing. Next element that I added in was, this comes in every once in a while. It's a little like cut of the vocals. It's very, very subtle, and you can hear there's a lot of still hearing this. There's a bunch of interesting delays going on, and so what this is I used this de-reverb thing. The vocal that I got was very like reverby, so I was trying to remove a little bit of that, a little bit of the auto shift to try to push it into tune. This roar device to kind of add a little bit of distortion to it, some compression to reduce the dynamic range and make a more consistent signal. And then really what's going on here, the main thing I think that's cool to point out is this crystallizer effect. It's just a granular echo, so it's really cool, and echoes out in a really interesting way and adds a really nice texture to stuff. I really love adding that in. Next thing that is been added here is this house string. And so this is a little like sampler device that I made that basically plays like a single string note, and then if you look over here, it plays and then loops it back and forth so it's endless. So that way you can have an endless string playing out without it like decaying down. And this is just a really cool technique that happens in a lot of house music. It's basically just a single string note that's just, you know, hidden that string note. Just, it like adds a little bit of like elevates the energy in an interesting way, fills out the sonic like soundscape a little bit too, and it's just an interesting technique that's been used a lot in house music. And then whatever this weird thing is, so this is a cool way that you can kind of like add something interesting to tunes. If you look up song starters and then put it in the key that of your song in Splice, you can find some interesting, more harmonically and rhythmically rich rhythmically rich samples to play with, and so that's kind of what I added in here. And then just I'm using this track spacer here so that it's pulling away from the piano a little bit and like trying to like not distract from the piano. Yeah, and then so I think at this point, after going over all the melodic stuff individually, have a listen to it now with that context all together and hear how all those elements kind of work together. And listen to how that sounds with the vocals, because usually when I'm doing this, I am playing with the vocal over top, because you want all the melodic elements that you're adding to be in service of that vocal. I feel like that's really, really important. So let's hear that now with the vocal. And with the bass. And then all together. And just the vocals, so you can kind of focus. Sounds sick as hell. So it's very, very, very similar to the Groove Assassin one. Main thing is that those pianos, and then I've kind of like pushed into a new territory by adding a lot of like weird atmospheric and dubby and textural effects, and that's kind of like my style that I like to focus on. But with that said, we are on a time budget here. We're trying to move to finish the song as quickly as possible, and so the next thing I want to focus on is the drums. So let's move on to the drums. At this point, earlier in the session, we've isolated our own kick. That's perfect. That's sounding great, and we had like the AI drum loop that we were using. And so what we're going to do is we're going to flick back and forth between what we're working on and the reference. And we kind of want to go over one element at a time. Start with what your ear hears the most as important. So usually this would be the kick first, and then after that it might be the open hat or like the snare, and then it's going to get a bit more intricate as you go along. This way you can kind of start with the kind of 3 rule that I like to do is similar to when we're talking about melodic stuff. You want to start with the pattern, then focus on the sound selection, and then the volume. And then an extra thing you can do is like the little bit of channel strip stuff that we're talking about. So with that said, let's kind of have a listen to the drums by themselves for a moment. Cool, so now you have an idea of how the whole thing sounds. Let's kind of dissect that a little bit by going over one by one the individual elements. Starting off, the first thing that really caught my ear was the open hat. So let's have a look and listen to that. So in terms of the pattern here, it looks a little bit more complicated than it is. I added in a ton of layers. I don't always do this, but in this instance I did. I was kind of, I feel like struggling a little bit to get that similar open hat sound, and when I struggle, I'm usually layering a lot more, which sucks. I think when you're on track with a sound, it's usually going to be just you pick one sound and you're good. But in this case, it didn't happen, so I'm going to kind of walk you through the struggle. Main thing that is set up here is in my template, I automatically have like the open hat set up here so that it's already on the offbeat. Very common for the open hat and close hat to be on the offbeat, so you might as well set up your template with an empty MIDI clip to already have that in. It's the way I like to think about it, because then what you can do also is you can grab everything and you can kind of like, if you have a drum rack set up with a bunch of different sounds, you can test them out very easily by moving this around, and you can also press Option and then like easily layer on additional sounds like that, which is what I did. So there's a couple of different sounds going on here, and there's a couple different techniques I did to find this sound. First is there's a couple of all these OH13, 16, whatever. I took the time to create a little drum rack for my open hats of my favorite like 5 or 6 open hat sounds. This way I'm not taking through hundreds of presets all the time or hundreds of samples all the time and making it different each time. There's a little bit of a cohesion, and it simplifies the process, and it makes it so there's like a cohesion from track to track because there's some similar elements going on. So I would recommend you kind of start to find your core sounds that you don't have to use every song, but it's like something that you can use for quite a few songs. And it's very subtle stuff, like an open hat. Not too many people are gonna like notice, oh, Jimmy used the same open hat last song, you know what I mean? So don't have to worry about it sounding monotonous, I would say, especially when you pair it with something like this. Similar to this, I guess this is the bass slice, but if you slice out, say, something from the intro or outro, like a drum hit, like the open hat, or if you can also do it from the AI, if you right click on it and say show similar files, you're gonna get a bunch of similar files from that slice there. So with the open hat, pretty easy to get a little slice and then do this, and you can find similar sounds in your library. And so that's essentially what I just did here. So for the open hat here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 additional sounds that I found by slicing a bit the open hat from the Groove Assassin tune, and then doing show similar files and then loading them into my drum rack and then just trying to layering them together here. In terms of any processing, what we're doing is a little bit of width, and that's really it, and removing a bunch of lows. The next thing that I added in was this, which was kind of like a weirder thing that I did this time, but if you have a listen to this. I just took like I made this like a different version of this track. I was really struggling with this open hat sound, so a different like project file that I had, I was like trying a different technique and came up with this, like found you use the show similar files and all that kind of stuff to find this particular layer of sounds, and then I exported and added in here. So this is a little bit weird for me. This was very experimental, but it was just something I was doing, trying to figure out. Like I was really trying to get this open hat sound. I couldn't really get it, so I was trying it in like other projects and then moved it into here. So just maybe a problem-solving technique that you can pick up on there, but not something I normally do. Next thing is these closed hats. Let's have a look and listen. So for these, with the closed hats, something I usually like to do is like always layer in the at least one open hat to support the closed hat. So you can see if we focus on this layer right here that I've highlighted, it's on the offbeat, just like the open hat. And this is nice because it kind of like reinforces the open hat, adds a little bit more of a punch to it, and it adds an arrangement technique in terms of you can pull out the open hat, like remove it, and then you still have this closed hat kind of driving and keeping things going. It's not like a complete empty silence there. And again, template kind of set this up so it was already there, and I just had to move it around. And the idea for the closed hat in this idea is you're trying to find something that's sonically similar to the open hat, like it almost blends in really nicely. And again, I have a bunch of I've pre-selected a bunch of closed hats here, signature closed hats you might say. And then the next thing was adding in this little skippiness to the pattern, which is something I definitely heard in the reference track. So it's just kind of playing off of the main offbeat closed hat here. In terms of the sound selection, kind of went over that already. In terms of the processing, just a little bit of removing the sustain to tighten up that sound a little bit, but the main thing is volumes. Next thing that I added in is normally I would add in like snares and claps and then move on to top hats after, but like I said, I was really struggling with this song to get like the percussion, like the open hats and closed hats and stuff working. So the next thing I added actually was this little bit here. So an interesting little kind of like tickety groovy, shuffly closed hat pattern. And main reason I was adding that in at this point is because I wasn't feeling satisfied with the hats. It seemed like there was something still missing, and so at this point I reached for like a loop in splice to try to get that going. In terms of any processing, removing a ton of the lows, some side chain, some width, and removing some of the sustain. Next thing I added in was the shaker loop. Again, still struggling with trying to feel good about the open hat and closed hat situation here, so I moved on to more loops to try to reinforce and add more information in the kind of hi-hat shakery territory. Have a listen and look. So for this, just looked up shakers on Splice, removed a bunch of lows, sidechain, some width, some sustain. Then again, wasn't feeling it still, so I looked up another shaker loop, which sounds like this. A bit of a different texture, maybe a little bit lower in like pitch sounding. Removing some lows, some sidechain, some width, some sustain. And then at that point I felt a bit better. Really, there was a big struggle here with the open hats and all that kind of stuff. And altogether it ended up sounding a bit like this, which I think sounds a bit nicer. Pretty interesting stuff. Still, the open hat still, I feel like there's room for improvement there, but it is what it is. Next element that I added in was this snare. So let's have a look and listen to this. This, I was struggling with this too. This song was, yeah, there was a lot of challenges for me on this one. This looks crazy, and I definitely understand that. But I'm starting with the snares. It's usually, there's like a beat on the 1.2, 1.4, 2.2, 2.4. And that's like the good place to start. For this one, there was like very much like a drum, like a snare playing like in between a lot. It's very snare heavy, this beat. So I kind of like added in maybe one layer at a time. So it's like poop pa poop poop pa pa poop poop pa pa poop kind of thing, and then just really struggling with the sound. So that's why I was like layering in a bunch of different sounds. For this, I have like a, again, snare rack that has some of my own sounds in here, and then I did a ton of like grabbing a slice of the snare from the reference, and then using the show similar files functionality to get some other options here. And I don't know, maybe it's just there wasn't anything close to it in my library that was working, and that's why I had to focus on layers and like more processing than I'd ever really would like to do. I added on like an instance of roar to add a bit of like saturation and distortion to the sound a little bit. Like, yeah, really struggling with the sound. Ultimately, I feel like it's good, but normally I don't like to have to spend this much time adding in all these different layers and stuff like that. I feel like, again, the best things are when you can find one sample that really just does a great job of it on its own. That simplicity is so important. In terms of any other processing, increase the attack a little bit, which is a little bit something I don't usually do, but wanted the snare to hit a little bit harder in terms of that transient initial hit. Pulled back the sustain a little bit to tighten it up. No sidechain on this. A little bit of removing some of the lows, but the main thing here is really dialing in the volumes when it comes to this. Then something I like to do usually is layering in a clap. So we have this. This is a lot more like how I usually like to have it. So usually what I'll do is I like to have snares and claps. This is a personal thing that I like to do, but I usually like to have snares kind of more down the middle and then claps a little bit left and right, being a bit more stereo, adding a bit more like high end to it. And in terms of the pattern, starting off with a 0.2, 0.4, 0.2, 0.4, and then something I like to do with this is at least layer on a little bit. So the first hit, there's two sounds, then it's by itself, and then two sounds, and then a different two sounds. This way, there's a bit of different samples playing. It adds like a humanization factor, keeps the loop sounding a bit more interesting and evolving over time. In terms of the sound selection, this is just like a clap drum rack that I made, maybe 5 or 6 of my favorite clap sounds that I like to use quite a bit. Simplifies the process quite a bit. And then if you need to find more, you can dig through your library or use the show similar files functionality in Ableton 12 to get more going on here, or more to use for your options for claps. What we're doing here is adding some width and removing some low end. Main thing is the volume, just trying to like nestle it into the snares. So then usually at this point is like the core loop is like kind of in there, the core hits. So we have like one shots doing the open hats, or all the hats, the kick, the snare, and all that. And then I'll usually start adding in some extra loops and stuff to kind of make it a little bit more interesting sounding. This one was a little bit different because I was struggling, so I was adding loops a little bit earlier. But that said, the next element that I added in was this kind of drum break. So this, I was just searching up drum breaks on Splice. A good trick is if you set the like top loops or drum breaks or anything like that to beats on transients and set the arrow to the right and then dial this back, it'll tighten up the sustain, similar to like what we're doing with the kilohertz transient shaper. Tighten up the sustain so things aren't going to ring out as long. And I feel like tighter top loops and breaks kind of mix in with your core hits a little bit more because they're not all loose and floppy. They're tighter, and so they're more supporting the core loops that you have going on there. Main thing is we're removing some lows, shelving up some of the highs, a little bit of sidechain, a little bit of width, a little bit of pulling back the sustain even more on the transient shaper here. Next thing I added in was this. So this is something I really heard in the Groove Assassin tune quite a bit. It's like this, like almost like little like hook or something, like a micro hook. It's like this extra little hi-hat accent that comes in every once in a while. Here, if you can kind of hear it by itself here, like you're listening for like do 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 tss, tss, do 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 tss, tss.
Yep.
that's what's going on there. There's just a couple of hi-hat sounds here. For some reason, I put on auto shift to try to make it more. I feel like it was almost like a weird sample that was sounding a little harmonic. I was trying to like bend it to the will of the tune here. I threw on this Golfoss because it was sounding way too. I was trying to like remove some of the high end in a nice way. This is like a dynamic smart EQ or something like that. But just trying to remove some of that high end because it's so harsh and shitty sounding. So really struggled with that. And then next thing, just a couple more elements, then we're almost good. Next thing I added was this. So what this is what you can do is find like a drum loop. So this is like a bongo loop that I found, and I believe if you right click on if you throw that into a sampler, you can right click it and say like, or you can do like slices, and then right click it and say convert to drum rack, and that way you have like the individual slices, and you kind of like make your own little bongo loop, which is basically what I did here. Cool little technique to spice up your loops. Sometimes it sounds cool to use them straight up, but yeah, sometimes it's cool to kind of chop them up and make your own little rhythm. And that's what I did here. In terms of any processing, removing lows, little side chain, little width, nothing too crazy. And then the last thing is just a ride that comes in every once in a while. And that's almost more of an arrangement trick. You can add in, it's almost like a nice arrangement trick. You can have closed hat to increase the energy, add an open hat, and then again to increase the energy, add a ride. And I think that kind of leads us into the next section that is perfect to go into, which is arrangement. So at this point, you can see the song has been completely arranged. Oh, you know what I want to talk about? The vocals. So super simple thing that happened here is like I was saying, basically the vocals just sounded like really whack, and basically the solution was crazy, honestly. Like, I can't believe it. If you remember from that previous session, I pitched it down one semitone. So basically, I must have been working on this high or something, because instead of, I pitched like the synth up one semitone, and then I pitched the vocals down one semitone. So I was just pushing them out of key, and it kind of sounded good in a weird way, because like maybe some of the notes of the vocals were hitting the same scale degrees, but ultimately it wasn't. It just sounded like shit. So yeah, I don't know, like be careful if you're smoking weed and working on tunes, which is something I do a bunch, and normally I don't make a mistake like this, but yeah, I had to pitch it up one semitone instead of down. So watch out for stuff like that, because like, and that's why I say like you want to really focus on the melodic stuff first, because if you can't figure out the solution to make your vocals work with the melodic stuff and the chords and the bass that you're adding, and that's not sounding, if that's sounding whack and you can't fix it, the tune's dead. The tune is dead. Like, so if you can get to that point sooner, like fail fast and fail often is kind of the idea. That's really in your best interest, because then you can move on to the next song and that kind of thing, and you haven't spent like weeks or hours on the tune. So really good lesson to learn there. Learn from the mistakes there. So next thing is the song structure. So you can see this tune is finished, but I want to kind of show you the technique. So the idea is to like build your loop so that you are kind of building like the biggest point of the loop, like the climax. That way, instead of when you're arranging, instead of like thinking you have to constantly add in new layers to make the next section hit harder, it's more of a process of subtraction. Let me kind of show you that. So what you can do is when you have your like loop, what you can do is grab a little loop marker here, and if you grab it from the top and press Control C and then paste it from the highest point, you can grab the whole thing very easily. So the idea is to like use your structure track that we made at the beginning of the process here, and what you can do is paste it into like the climax of the tune, like the biggest drop, and this way you kind of get a little bit of context of knowing like what you're doing is you're working all of these structures, the points of the tune here is working towards this drop. So you don't necessarily want this drop to hit as hard as this drop, because this is the main big sick drop. Then what you can do is you can use these pieces that these sections as puzzle pieces to fill out your structure very, very quickly using this structure track, as well as like the reference track. You can flick back and forth to the reference track here. And so what I mean by that is like intro is usually a drum intro, right? So what you can do is just grab these puzzle pieces here and just go boom, 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 boom. Usually in the first half, maybe there's no kick, so you can press 0 to remove that non-destructively, and then have the kick come in. Then it says sub here, right? So then you might want to grab all the drums and then grab the bass And you can actually kind of do it blind, but what I would recommend is like kind of going section by section and then flicking back and forth between what you have and the reference, and listening to the layers of what's going on in the reference track, in the intro here, and making yours similar, and paying attention to every 8 to 16 bars. Every 8 bars or so there might be a small change, maybe a layer gets added or subtracted, and then every like 16 bars or so you're like you might see a larger change. So this is probably 32, but so you can see here, boom, and then there's a larger song structure change. So for example, between like just the drums playing and the sub playing, that's a larger song structure change. So that's a bigger change, very impactful on the listener. So that's kind of the idea you want to think about it. So what we can do is just kind of run through this a little bit here. So it starts off with an intro. Main thing is there's quite a bit of drums, but there is some melodic stuff going on and a little bit of that vocal. More elements are getting added in. Even more, it's kind of like filtering in. That's something you want to kind of think of, is like from section to section, focusing on like EQ automation, so removing some of the lows, and then as well as layering as well. You can create tension and release between each of the sections. And so then, for example, we have that kick somewhat in here, and then the last 8 bars we remove it. And then again, right before the drop, so you can remove a bunch of stuff and just have like a few of the melodic elements coming in. Like that stuff is just, it builds some tension by delayering basically. Then we have the sub in. After the 8 bars, that open ride comes in. A little trick is to remove the kick right before a section. Boom. Tease in the vocal a little bit, and then a break. So we're just removed the kick, and I think we're starting to introduce the vocal here. And then pull out everything for a bit. See, there's tension, 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 and release. So this is like a trick that I like to do sometimes. Like you can build up the vocal, like filtering it in like that, and then you just remove it and have like a bit of the vocal like echo out, and then you can start filtering the vocal back in. Or I think it filters in here. You can hear it filtering in. And then it fully kicks in here. Little trick. And then it kind of builds down the energy back into the sub, so it's kind of starting to remove the vocal. Started adding in some extra like weird piano stuff and stuff, slowly filtering in. And then we got our big breakdown. You can hear there's a little piano ripping. We're trying to slowly build down the energy more and more until we build the energy down to this. And then build it down even less. See, it's like slowly. I think this is a really fun part to really focus on, the break here. I don't know, this sounds almost nothing like the reference track. Definitely what you want to do is like start by making your structure very similar to the reference track, and then eventually you want to pull away and kind of do your own thing. And the breaks in particular, I think, is a really great opportunity to kind of like go nuts and like make it really interesting and memorable. That's something that I like to do for sure. That kind of like gives you a good rundown of of how to run through this. Then there's some extra stuff here, like in the master effects. I almost have like what I have. If you look at that, actually, you could probably see the automation on this. This is like a low cut EQ, so I'm removing like the lows throughout the tune at a bunch of different times, very similar to how a DJ would, and then having these like master effects that are adding like reverb and delay and kind of like riser sounds on the master is a really easy way to kind of like add some more oomph to a bunch of the breaks and the transitions and make things sound a little bit smoother from section to section. And then the last thing is adding in like sound effects like crashes and risers. I have some good videos on how to implement these as well. And then the last thing is, how do you actually know when this song is done? And you can actually move on. That's a tough question. You kind of almost can't ever. But what you can do is a couple of little tricks here. One thing I like to do is something called pick 3. The idea is when you're feeling pretty good and you've gotten to this point, it's been arranged, you added some master effects and sound effects and stuff like that, those little bits of ear candy, picking 3 things that you really want to focus on and having those 3 things be the thing that's going to have the most impact on the listener. So for example, a decibel of EQ removing like a frequency on the kick, no one's going to probably notice that. But for example, if your breakdown is sounding flat and doesn't feel awesome going into the drop, people are going to notice that. Focus on fixing that as one of your 3 things. Do 3 things, finish those 3 things, and commit to being like, cool, we're done. The last thing I do like to do is adding a bit of compression and clipping on some of the buses here, and that's really just in an effort to reduce the dynamic range. And then sometimes what I like to do is throw this track spacer on the melodic stuff too, so you can have it sidechain against the vocal, and what it'll do is it'll remove some of the vocals frequencies only when the vocal's playing to kind of give some space for the vocals to come out a little bit more. Small things like that, and then this like really quick 10-minute like mastering chain that I have here that I promise to make a video on at some point in time. But that's a really good look here. I think if you want to jump into the project file in more detail, definitely can. I'm gonna have to remove the vocals and like one of the synth lines or so, because it's my homie's vibe stuff, so I can't give that out. But this is a really awesome project file to find like some really cool details, in particular like the automation and how parts flow into each other. I could talk about it all day, but I think going through the project file and seeing the automation and hearing it and turning things off and on and seeing how sections are being layered and delayered into section to section is really helpful from a structure standpoint. With that said, let's jump into a recap of the 80-20 rule here so you can apply as much as possible to what you've seen in this video into your own productions as quick as you can. Hi, my friend, Matt from Best Friends Club here, and if you've been paying attention to this super long video, then you've probably figured out what the 80-20 rule is when it comes to building out your songs. The goal here is to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the time, energy, and effort. And because the first key to the 80-20 rule here is to use a reference track, we're making sure that we're very easily hitting 80% of a high quality, professionally made song. In particular, we use that reference track to make sure that we're picking the right notes, sounds, and volumes as we're building out our song. The second key of the 80-20 rule here is to mix as you go in an extremely streamlined way by only focusing on the volume of each track, as well as using a simple repeatable channel strip for each track that we're adding to our songs. The third and final key is to repurpose your old project files and have a suite of powerful templates, Ableton racks, and one-knob effects that you've personalized and curated over time. If you'd like to get a head start by downloading all the racks, templates, and all the files that you've seen me use in the Ableton project file for this video, or if you'd just like to take a closer look at any of the techniques or tracks you saw me work on in this video at your own pace, you can find a link to this video's project files on screen now and at the second link that's in the YouTube description. I'm recreating a different song from the Beatport top charts every single week and making the project files available to anyone who wants them. You'll also get access to a private Discord where you can ask me and the community questions, as well as share tracks for feedback. If you or your music are not quite ready for a shot in the arm like that, I've also made you a completely free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that have helped me figure out how to completely finish one new song each and every single week. And you can grab that free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit by visiting the first link that's in the YouTube description here. However, if you just feel like staying on YouTube for now, that's totally fine. Save that link for later, and check out this playlist filled with videos just like the one you just watched, where I completely create songs inspired by tracks found in the Beatport top charts. Or if you really want to take what you've learned in this video to the next level, make sure you check out this video right here.